This video explores historical events using published sources for educational purposes. Interpretations are attributed to historians. No claims are asserted as fact without citation. The night air hung thick over the Mississippi River on November 15, 1876. In the grand parlors of Natchez, oil lamps flickered against mahogany walls while plantation owners toasted their return to power. But in the shadows beyond their gleaming windows, something else stirred. Something they had dismissed as broken, silent, forgotten. By dawn, the cobblestone streets would run red, and the name Natchez would be whispered in terror across the South. What happened that night wasn't just a violent uprising. It was the reckoning that white Mississippi had been dreading since the first chains were broken. Before we dive into this forbidden chapter of American history, drop a comment telling us where you are watching from and what time it is there. And don't forget to subscribe to uncover more hidden stories they don't teach in school. The year 1876 marked the death of hope in Mississippi. Not the kind of death that comes with fanfare or ceremony, but the slow, strangling kind that creeps through communities like fog through a graveyard. President Grant had abandoned the South to its own devices, and white Democrats had seized control through what they called redemption. But redemption for whom? Certainly not for the 4 million souls who had tasted freedom only to watch it slip through their fingers like water through cupped hands. Natchez stood like a crown jewel along the Mississippi River, its antebellum mansions rising like monuments to a world that refused to die. Here, cotton money had built empires, and those empires had built themselves on the backs of human property. Even after emancipation, even after Reconstruction, the old ways clung to these river bluffs like Spanish moss to ancient oaks. The names had changed, but the game remained the same. In 1876, Natchez was a city caught between worlds. The grand mansions still dominated the landscape, their white columns gleaming in the Mississippi sun like bones bleached by time. Inside these palaces, former slaveholders had reinvented themselves as employers, landlords, creditors. They spoke of progress, of healing, of moving forward together, but their smiles were thin as paper, and beneath them lay the same hunger that had always driven them, the hunger for control, for superiority, for the right to own not just land, but the very souls who worked it. The streets of Natchez told two stories. Above, on the bluffs, carriages rolled past manicured gardens where ladies in silk dresses sipped tea and spoke of charity work among the less fortunate. Below, near the river, a different world existed. Here, in an area locals called Natchez Under the Hill, freed slaves and their children crowded into shacks that leaked when it rained and burned when it didn't. They worked the docks, loaded cotton bales, swept floors, and cooked meals for wages that barely kept them alive. Freedom, they had learned, was just another word for choosing which master to serve. But something was different in the autumn of 1876. Something had shifted in the air, in the way people looked at each other, in the conversations that stopped when white folks walked by. The recent elections had been a bloodbath of voter intimidation and fraud. Black men who had once cast ballots with pride now stayed home on election day, their votes stolen by violence and their voices silenced by fear. The Mississippi Plan, as white Democrats called it, had worked perfectly. They had reclaimed their state without firing a single shot in open battle. Instead, they had used night riders, economic pressure, and carefully orchestrated terror to break the spirit of resistance. Yet resistance had not died. It had simply gone underground, hidden in the places where white eyes couldn't see, whispered in languages they couldn't understand, passed through networks they couldn't imagine. In the churches that met after midnight, in the kitchens where servants prepared meals for their former masters, in the fields where sharecroppers bent their backs to someone else's profit, a different conversation was taking place. A conversation about dignity, about justice, about the price of freedom and who should pay it. The man they called Reverend Moses Washington had arrived in Natchez just after the war ended. Nobody knew much about his past, and he didn't volunteer information. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with hands that looked like they'd known hard work, and eyes that seemed to see more than they should. He could read and write, which made him dangerous in the eyes of white Natchez. He could preach with a voice that made grown men weep and women shout hallelujah, which made him valuable to the black community. And he could organize, bringing together field hands and house servants, dock workers and washerwomen, under the banner of spiritual salvation and earthly justice. Washington's church sat at the edge of Natchez under the hill, a simple wooden structure that had once housed a saloon before the congregation pooled their pennies to buy it from a white owner who thought he was cheating them. Every Sunday, voices rose from that building in songs that spoke of crossing Jordan, of freedom trains, of promised lands that existed not just in heaven but right here on earth. White folks dismissed it as harmless religious enthusiasm, the way enslaved people had always expressed their hopes and fears through spirituals. They were wrong. What they couldn't see, wouldn't allow themselves to see, was that Moses Washington was building something more than a congregation. He was building a network, a web of connection that stretched from the mansions on the bluff to the cotton fields beyond the city limits. House servants reported on their employers' plans and weaknesses. Field hands shared information about which landowners were most vulnerable, which overseers drank too much, which roads were watched and which were clear. Dock workers knew when shipments came and went, who was traveling and when they'd return. Washerwomen heard conversations their employers forgot they were having, secrets spilled over dirty laundry and careless words. The network grew slowly, carefully, like a vine that knows better than to show itself too soon. Washington preached patience, preparation, the importance of choosing the right moment to act. But patience was wearing thin in the autumn of 1876. The violence of the recent election season had pushed many beyond their breaking point. Stories filtered in from across Mississippi, tales of midnight raids and disappeared men, of families torn apart and communities terrorized into submission. In Clinton, just north of Natchez, white Democrats had turned a political rally into a bloodbath, hunting down Republican voters like animals. In Vicksburg, armed gangs had taken control of the city, driving out black officials and installing their own puppet government. The message was clear across Mississippi. The brief experiment in racial equality was over. Black folks could work, they could pray, they could even make a little money if they were careful and quiet. But they could not vote, could not hold office, could not challenge the natural order of things. That natural order demanded submission, silence, acceptance of whatever crumbs fell from the master's table. It required black folks to smile when insulted, to step aside when white folks approached, to lower their eyes and tip their hats and remember their place. It insisted that freedom was not a right, but a privilege that could be revoked at any moment by those who truly held power. Moses Washington watched this system reassert itself with the patience of a man who understood that every action creates an equal and opposite reaction. He had lived through slavery, had felt the lash across his back and the chains around his ankles. He had also lived through emancipation, had tasted the sweet wine of citizenship, and seen his people stand tall in the halls of power. Now he watched that progress being stripped away, one law at a time, one intimidated voter at a time, one terrorized family at a time. But Washington knew something that white Mississippi had forgotten in their rush to reclaim control. He knew that people pushed beyond their limits don't simply break, sometimes they explode. The explosion, when it came, would catch white Natchez completely by surprise. They had grown comfortable in their restored dominance, confident that the old ways were the natural ways. permanent and unchangeable as the river that flowed past their city. They had forgotten that the same river that brought them wealth and power could also bring destruction, washing away everything they thought was solid and permanent. The first whispers began in the tobacco warehouses where black workers sorted leaves under the watchful eyes of white overseers. Someone had seen riders moving through the night, not the usual patrol of white vigilantes, but something different. Black men on horseback, faces covered, moving with purpose through the back roads that connected plantation to plantation. The overseers dismissed these reports as fantasy, the kind of wild stories that spread through communities when fear and desperation mixed with darkness. But Moses Washington knew better. He had been expecting this, preparing for this, for months. The network he had built was finally ready to act, and the moment they had all been waiting for was approaching, like a storm gathering strength over the river. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, terrible in its scope. For too long, white Natchez had relied on the labor, loyalty, and silence of the very people they oppressed. House servants knew their masters' routines, their habits, their vulnerabilities. Field hands understood which roads were traveled, which houses stood isolated, which families would be easiest to reach. Dock workers controlled the flow of goods and information along the river. Washerwomen moved freely between white and black communities, invisible in their usefulness. What if all of that invisible knowledge suddenly turned against those who had taken it for granted? What if the very system of oppression became the weapon of liberation? Washington had studied the recent violence across Mississippi, learned from the tactics that white Democrats had used to reclaim power. They had succeeded through coordination, through striking simultaneously across multiple locations, through creating such widespread chaos that resistance became impossible. The same strategy could work in reverse, he reasoned. If Black Natchez could act with unity and purpose, they might accomplish in one night what decades of patient submission had failed to achieve. The date was set for November 15th, the night of the harvest moon when the river would be bright enough to see by, but shadows would still provide cover. Washington chose this date carefully, knowing that many of the white families would be attending a grand ball at Rosemount Plantation, one of the most prestigious estates in the area. The cream of Natchez society would be gathered in one place, dancing and drinking while their homes stood vulnerable, protected only by the servants they trusted completely. Those servants had been meeting in secret for weeks, gathering in the basement of Washington's church where thick stone walls muffled sound and small windows allowed lookouts to watch for unexpected visitors. They came in ones and twos, arriving at different times, using different routes. Housemaids who had scrubbed floors while listening to their employers planned the violent suppression of black voters. Cooks who had prepared meals while hearing discussions of which black leaders needed to be eliminated. Stable hands who had cared for the horses that carried night riders to terrorize black families. Each brought information. Each carried grievances that went deeper than mere economic exploitation. Sarah, who cooked for the Chamberlain family, had watched her teenage daughter sold away just 2 years after emancipation, taken by creditors who claimed her former master's debts. Joshua, who tended the gardens at Magnolia Hall, bore scars across his back from a beating he received for looking directly at his employer's wife. Mary, who cleaned house for Judge Morrison, had seen her son disappear after he tried to register to vote, his body found weeks later in a bayou 20 miles from town. These were not random acts of rebellion born from sudden anger. They were calculated responses to systematic cruelty, planned with the cold precision that survival had taught them. Washington preached patience, but he also preached justice, and sometimes, he reminded his followers, justice required action that went beyond prayer and hope. The weapons were gathered slowly, carefully. Kitchen knives disappeared from their usual places, Axes meant for splitting firewood found new hiding spots. Rope used for hanging laundry was measured and cut to different lengths. Most importantly, they stockpiled oil and lard, the same cooking supplies that had always been part of their daily work, now repurposed for a darker feast. As November 15th approached, the tension in Natchez became almost visible. White folks complained that their servants seemed distracted, slower to respond, quicker to gather in whispering groups. Some noticed that their house staff asked unusual questions about schedules, about who would be home on certain nights, about which families were traveling. But these observations were dismissed as the natural curiosity of simple minds, nothing more threatening than gossip and idle chatter. The Black community, meanwhile, moved with a different energy. Children were sent to stay with relatives in distant counties. Valuable possessions were hidden or moved to safer locations. Escape routes were planned and memorized. Those who would participate in the action prepared themselves with the solemnity of soldiers going to war, while those who would not were given instructions on how to claim innocence when the inevitable questions came. Washington spent the days leading up to November 15th in prayer and preparation. He had studied the tactics of slave rebellions from across the Americas, learning from the successes and failures of those who had fought before him. He knew that surprise would be their greatest advantage, but also their most fragile asset. Once the first house was struck, word would spread quickly. They would have perhaps 2 hours of darkness before organized resistance began to form. In those 2 hours, they would need to accomplish what generations of his people had only dreamed of. The Reverend also understood that success would bring its own dangers. White Mississippi would not simply accept such a challenge to their restored authority. The response would be swift, brutal, and comprehensive. Federal troops were no longer available to protect Black communities. Local law enforcement served white interests exclusively. The same networks that had enabled the Mississippi Plan would mobilize to crush any sign of Black resistance with overwhelming force. But Washington had concluded that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds. His people had tried patience, had tried legal channels, had tried working within a system designed to exploit them. They had voted when allowed, served in office when elected, built businesses when permitted, and they had watched it all stripped away by violence and fraud. Their dreams crushed under the boots of men who spoke of civilization while practicing barbarism. The night of November 15th arrived with unusual warmth for late autumn. The harvest moon rose full and bright over the Mississippi River, casting silver light across the bluffs where Natchez's grandest mansions stood like sentinels overlooking their domain. In those mansions, final preparations were being made for the evening's festivities. Ladies fastened jewelry around throats that had never known chains, while their maids helped them into gowns that cost more than most Black families earned in a year. The servants moved through their duties with practiced efficiency, but beneath their calm exterior, hearts raced with anticipation and terror. They checked and rechecked their hidden weapons, reviewed their assigned targets, whispered final prayers for courage and forgiveness. Each knew that by morning everything would be different. Either they would have struck a blow for justice that would echo across the South, or they would be dead, their bodies swinging from the same trees that had witnessed generations of similar atrocities. At Rosemount Plantation, carriages began arriving just after sunset. The elite of Natchez society emerged in their finest attire, chattering about recent political victories and economic opportunities. They spoke of the troublesome elections finally resolved, of order restored to their community, of the natural hierarchy properly re-established. Inside the mansion, musicians tuned their instruments while servants arranged tables laden with delicacies prepared by Black hands for white consumption. None of them noticed that several of those serving hands moved with unusual precision, that certain servants exchanged meaningful glances, that the usual cheerful chatter in the kitchen had been replaced by focused silence. The masters saw only what they expected to see: loyal, subservient workers, grateful for employment and protection. They could not imagine that those same workers might harbor thoughts of revolution, might possess the intelligence and organization necessary to threaten the social order they took for granted. Miles away, in the simple church where Moses Washington had built his congregation and his conspiracy, the final meeting was taking place. 50 men and women knelt in prayer, their voices rising in familiar hymns that spoke of crossing rivers and reaching promised lands. But tonight, the metaphors carried different meaning. Tonight, the river they would cross was made of blood, and the promised land lay on the other side of violence their oppressors had taught them to understand. Washington rose to address his followers one final time. His voice carried the weight of scripture and the edge of steel as he reminded them of their purpose, their methods, their sacred duty to those who had suffered and died under the system they were about to challenge. He spoke of justice delayed becoming justice denied, of turning the other cheek until both cheeks were bloodied beyond recognition, of the moment when patience transformed into something harder and more necessary. The clock in the church tower began to chime midnight, each note ringing across the sleeping city like a countdown to judgment. As the 12th chime faded into silence, Moses Washington raised his hand in blessing and dismissal. His followers filed out into the moonlit night, moving toward their assigned positions with the quiet determination of people who had finally decided that some things were worth dying for. In the grand ballroom at Rosemount, the orchestra played on, violins weaving melodies that spoke of romance and refinement, while couples swirled across polished floors. The white elite of Natchez celebrated their restored dominance, toasting their success in crushing the hopes of those they considered their natural inferiors. They had no way of knowing that in houses across their city, their most trusted servants were no longer servants at all, but soldiers in an army they had never imagined could exist. The reckoning Moses Washington had promised was about to begin. The first house to feel the weight of justice belonged to Judge Nathaniel Morrison, the man who had sentenced more black men to prison labor than any other magistrate in Adams County. His mansion stood proud on the bluff, 3 stories of white columns and red brick that proclaimed his authority over law and order in Natchez. Tonight, that authority would be tested by laws older than any he had written in his leather-bound books. Sarah Jenkins had polished those same floors for 7 years, had served tea to visitors who spoke casually of keeping the colored population in line. She had smiled and nodded while cleaning blood from the judge's writing crop, had pressed his robes while he planned which black leaders needed to disappear. But Sarah remembered things too. She remembered her brother Marcus, dragged from his bed for the crime of teaching children to read. She remembered the trial that lasted 20 minutes, the sentence that sent him to a work camp where he died of fever within a month. Judge Morrison had been at Rosemount for barely an hour when Sarah made her move. The house stood empty except for the elderly groundskeeper who slept in the carriage house, too far away to hear what was about to unfold. Sarah moved through rooms she knew better than their owner did, lighting oil lamps with steady hands, positioning them exactly where they needed to be. The judge's study, where he kept his private papers and hidden bottles of whiskey, would burn brightest. The parlor, where he entertained visitors who shared his views on racial superiority, would follow. But the kitchen, where Sarah had endured years of casual cruelty, would be where the real message was written. The flames caught quickly in the dry November air, racing up curtains and across polished wood with hungry enthusiasm. Sarah stood in the doorway for just a moment, watching 7 years of silent rage finally find its voice in crackling orange tongues that licked at everything the judge held sacred. Then she disappeared into the night, moving toward her next assignment with the fluid grace of someone who had finally found her purpose. Across town, the Whitman estate experienced its own revelation. Thomas Whitman owned the largest cotton warehouse in Natchez, where black workers sorted and baled the harvest under conditions that made slavery look merciful by comparison. His foreman used a leather strap to encourage productivity, and his books showed wages that barely covered the cost of company housing and overpriced food from the company store. The workers called it freedom, but the chains had simply become invisible, made of debt and desperation instead of iron and steel. Moses, who had loaded cotton bales since dawn every day for 3 years, knew exactly where Whitman kept his records. The ledgers that showed which workers owed money, which families could be evicted, which men had spoken too freely about fair wages. These books were the real chains that bound his community, more effective than any overseer's whip because they made resistance seem hopeless, made debt feel like destiny. The warehouse stood near the river, its wooden wall seasoned by years of Mississippi humidity. Moses had brought friends, men whose backs ached from lifting bales that made other men rich while they remained poor. They worked with quiet efficiency, soaking the building's interior with lamp oil, while carefully removing the cotton bales that represented months of their unpaid labor. This wasn't random destruction. This was accounting, balancing books that had been kept in blood and sweat instead of ink and numbers. When the flames finally rose above the warehouse roof, they could be seen from Rosemount Plantation, where the evening's festivities continued without pause. Someone mentioned smoke in the distance, but November was burning season, and plantation owners often cleared fields after harvest. The orchestra played on, violins weaving melodies that masked the sound of justice crackling across the night air. At the Chamberlain Mansion, Mary Washington moved through her final evening of service with the solemnity of a priest performing last rites. She had cooked for this family since emancipation, had watched their children grow into copies of their parents, learning to see black folks as property that happened to walk upright. Young Master Robert, now 22, had his father's eyes and his grandfather's casual cruelty. He had taken liberties with house girls that went unpunished, had beaten stable boys for imagined slights, had spoken of the good old days when discipline meant something. Mary's own daughter had disappeared 2 years ago, sold to pay gambling debts that Robert had accumulated during his college years in New Orleans. The girl was 16, barely old enough to understand what was happening when the traders came for her. Mary had begged, had offered her own savings, had promised years of unpaid labor in exchange for her child's freedom. The Chamberlains had laughed at her desperation, had reminded her that colored folks shouldn't get too attached to their children since nature hadn't equipped them for proper family feelings. Tonight, Mary carried more than kitchen knives and lamp oil. She carried the weight of every mother who had watched her children disappear into the machinery of human commerce. Every woman who had smiled while serving food to the men who destroyed her family. The Chamberlain kitchen had always been her domain, but tonight it would become something else entirely. Tonight it would become a courtroom where verdicts were written in flame, and justice was served at temperatures hot enough to melt lies. The family silver melted beautifully, Mary discovered. The same serving pieces she had polished every week for 7 years, twisted into shapeless metal that would never again grace a table built on stolen labor. The dining room, where the Chamberlains had entertained guests with stories of their magnanimous treatment of their former slaves, filled with smoke that carried the scent of burning privilege. The portrait of the family patriarch, who had built his fortune on the sale of human flesh, curled at the edges before disappearing entirely into ash and memory. But Mary saved the most sacred work for last. In Robert Chamberlain's bedroom, she found the letters he had written to friends in New Orleans, boasting of his conquests among the house girls, describing black women in terms that revealed the depth of his sickness. These letters burned slowly, their edges glowing like tiny suns as words of violation and dominance transformed into smoke and silence. By now, the night sky above Natchez glowed with more than moonlight. 3 fires had become 6, then 12, then too many to count, as the network Moses Washington had built revealed its true scope. House servants across the city had turned their intimate knowledge of white families into weapons more precise than any military strike. They knew which rooms held the most valuable possessions, which documents would cause the most damage if destroyed, which symbols of power would send the clearest message when reduced to ash. The fires spoke a language that white Natchez had never bothered to learn, but understood instinctively. This wasn't random violence or mindless destruction. This was communication, a message written in flames that said the age of silent suffering was ending. Every burning mansion represented years of accumulated grievances, decades of unpaid wages, and stolen children and casual humiliations that had festered in hearts forced to remain quiet. At a Rosemount plantation, the dancing finally stopped when a breathless rider arrived with news that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Half the city seemed to be burning, he reported, and the fires were spreading faster than any natural blaze. Worse still, they seemed to be targeting specific houses, specific families, with an intelligence that suggested planning rather than accident. The ballroom erupted in confusion as Natchez's elite struggled to comprehend what was happening to their world. Some demanded immediate action, calling for armed riders to put down whatever uprising was underway. Others insisted this must be some kind of accident, a series of unfortunate coincidences that would be easily explained once cooler heads investigated. But a few, the ones who understood their servants better than they cared to admit, looked around the room and began to count which black faces were missing from their usual positions. The realization came slowly, like dawn breaking over men who had spent their lives in deliberate darkness. Their most trusted servants, the people who knew their routines and weaknesses better than their own families did, were not just absent from tonight's festivities. They were actively working against them, using decades of forced intimacy as weapons in a war that white Natchez had never imagined they were fighting. Judge Morrison was among the first to understand the true scope of what was happening. His house was gone, he learned, burned so completely that even the stone foundation was cracked from the heat. But more than property had been destroyed. His legal papers, his private correspondence, his carefully maintained records of which black leaders had been targeted for harassment, all of it had vanished in flames that seemed to burn with unusual intensity and purpose. The judge's face went pale as he calculated what this meant. Those papers contained evidence of activities that, while perfectly legal under Mississippi law, might prove embarrassing if they fell into the wrong hands. Letters from other officials coordinating voter intimidation, lists of black families targeted for economic pressure, detailed plans for maintaining white political control through methods that stopped just short of open warfare. If copies of those documents existed elsewhere, if they had been read before being burned, the implications could reach far beyond Natchez. Thomas Whitman received similar news about his warehouse and his workers' housing. The financial records that kept his employees trapped in cycles of debt were gone, but so were the cotton reserves that represented his liquid wealth. Without those bales, he couldn't meet his obligations to buyers in New Orleans and Liverpool. Without his records, he couldn't prove which workers owed him money or which families lived in his properties. His entire system of control had literally gone up in smoke, leaving him with land and buildings but no way to extract profit from the people who worked them. As reports continued to arrive, a pattern emerged that chilled the blood of every planter and merchant in the ballroom. The fires weren't random at all. They were targeting the infrastructure of white supremacy with surgical precision, destroying the documents and symbols that maintained racial hierarchy while leaving churches and schools and genuine community resources untouched. Someone had studied their system carefully enough to identify its weak points, then struck those points simultaneously across the entire city. The flames died by dawn, but their message burned eternal. Moses Washington's network had accomplished what seemed impossible, transforming trusted servants into architects of reckoning, turning the very system of oppression into its own undoing. They wrote no manifestos, left no speeches, but their fire-written words spoke louder than any declaration ever could. The forgotten uprising of Natchez proved that resistance lives in the most unexpected places, that justice delayed can become justice delivered by hands that know exactly where power keeps its secrets. History buried this story because it revealed an uncomfortable truth, that those dismissed as powerless had been watching, learning, waiting for their moment to remind the world that dignity cannot be destroyed, only delayed. Remember their names, share their story, because some truths refuse to stay buried no matter how deep the grave.